You got a raise this year. Maybe 3%, maybe 5%. Maybe your boss called it generous. Maybe you felt for about a week like things were finally moving in the right direction. And then you went to the grocery store. And the number at the checkout was higher than it was 6 months ago. And your rent went up. And your electricity bill went up. And the coffee you buy every morning, the one small thing you decided not to cut, went up. And somewhere between the raise and the grocery store, you realized something that nobody in your workplace is going to say out loud. You are poorer than you were last year. Not on paper. On paper, your salary is higher. But in terms of what that salary actually buys, in terms of real purchasing power, which is the only number that actually matters, you are behind. And the strange part is that this is not an accident. It is not bad luck. It is not inflation being unpredictable or markets being chaotic. It is a system, and the system is working exactly as designed. This is the story of why wages fall behind, not sometimes, not in bad economies, but structurally, consistently, and in ways that the people setting those wages understand far better than the people receiving them. Here is why this is not just a personal frustration. It is one of the defining economic tensions of the last 5 decades. Since 1979, worker productivity in the United States has risen by roughly 90%. In plain terms, the average American worker produces nearly twice as much economic value per hour as they did 45 years ago. Their wages, adjusted for inflation, have risen by about 15% over the same period. 90% versus 15%. That gap does not close itself. That gap is a transfer. Somewhere, the value that workers created but did not receive went somewhere else. And understanding where it went and who decided that is one of the most important economic questions of our time. This is not just an American story. The same pattern, with local variations, appears in the United Kingdom, in Australia, across most of Western Europe. Workers in developed economies are, by most measures, generating more value than at any point in history, and the share of that value they take home has been quietly, steadily falling for decades. The question is not whether this is happening. The data is unambiguous. The question is why, and the answer is more structural and more political than most people expect. To understand why wages fall behind, you need to understand how wages are actually set, and it is probably not the way you think. Most people assume wages are set by the market, supply and demand. If workers are scarce, wages go up. If workers are plentiful, wages go down. Simple economics. That story is partially true, but it is missing the most important variable: power. Wages are not just a price. They are the outcome of a negotiation. And like every negotiation, the result depends on who has more leverage, who can afford to walk away, who needs the deal more. For most of the 20th century, workers in developed economies had a mechanism that gave them collective leverage: unions. At their peak in the 1950s, roughly 35% of American workers were union members. In some industries, manufacturing, steel, auto, the number was much higher. A union is, at its core, a tool for solving a coordination problem. An individual worker asking for a raise can be replaced. 1,000 workers walking off the job cannot be replaced overnight. The threat of collective action, the strike, gave workers a credible bargaining position that individual negotiation never could. And it worked. The post-war decades, from roughly 1945 to 1975, were the period of the most broadly shared economic growth in modern American history. Productivity rose. Wages rose with it. The gap between executive pay and worker pay was relatively compressed. The middle class expanded. Economists sometimes call this period the Great Compression. The distance between the top and the bottom of the income distribution narrowed. Not because capitalism suddenly became kind, because workers had enough power to extract their fair share of the value they created. Then, in the late 1970s and through the 1980s, that power began to erode. Union membership fell from 35% of workers to under 10% today. A combination of factors drove this: deliberate policy choices, the shift from manufacturing to service industries where unionization is harder, globalization that allowed companies to move production to lower-wage countries, and a sustained ideological campaign that reframed unions as obstacles to growth rather than architects of it. As union membership fell, the leverage shifted, and wages, gradually, then noticeably, began to fall behind. But declining union power is only half the story. There is a second mechanism, less understood, less discussed, and in some ways more insidious. Economists call it monopsony. It sounds obscure. It is not. You have probably heard of a monopoly. One seller, no competition, prices go up. Monopsony is the mirror image. One buyer, no competition for the buyer, prices go down. In a labor market, the buyer is the employer, and when workers have only one or two realistic employers to choose from, wages go down. Think about a small town with one major employer, a factory, a hospital, a distribution center. Workers in that town cannot easily move. They have mortgages, families, community ties. Their realistic alternatives are limited. The employer knows this, and the wage they offer reflects it. This used to be a problem in specific places and specific industries, but economists have documented increasingly that it has become a feature of the modern labor market far more broadly than previously understood. A 2018 study found that more than half of all local labor markets in the United States showed significant concentration, meaning workers in those markets had fewer employer choices than a competitive market would provide. The result was suppressed wages, not because of some conspiracy, because of arithmetic. Fewer choices means less leverage, means lower pay. And then there's something even more subtle: non-compete agreements. Until recently, it was common for employers, not just in tech or finance, but in fast food, healthcare, retail, to require workers to sign agreements saying they would not work for a competitor for a period of time after leaving. A fast food worker bound by a non-compete clause. The economic purpose of a non-compete is to suppress wage competition between employers. If you cannot take your skills to a rival, the rival cannot bid for your labor. The employer who already has you does not need to match anyone's offer. At its peak, an estimated 30% of American workers were bound by some form of non-compete agreement. Most of them had no idea it was suppressing their wages. They just knew their paycheck felt stuck. Now let us do some arithmetic that your employer's HR department will never do for you. Inflation is not neutral. It does not affect everyone equally. It is, in practice, a regressive force, meaning it hits people with lower incomes harder than people with higher incomes. Here's why. Wealthy households hold assets, stocks, real estate, businesses. When inflation rises, central banks raise interest rates. Higher interest rates slow inflation, but also tend to push asset prices down. Wealthy households feel some pain, but they also have savings, diversified investments, and buffers. Working households spend most of what they earn. They hold little to no assets. Their wealth, such as it is almost entirely in their paycheck. When inflation rises, the purchasing power of that paycheck falls immediately. Every dollar buys less. There is no asset portfolio to partially offset the loss. This means that a 3% salary increase in a 4% inflation environment is not close to neutral. It's a real wage cut of approximately 1%. And if that pattern holds for 5 years, which it did in many economies after 2021, a worker who received regular nominal raises every year can end up meaningfully poorer in real terms than when they started. Here's the number that should make you stop.
The Economic Policy Institute found that between 1978 and 2018, CEO compensation in the United States grew by 940%. Over the same period, typical worker pay grew by 12%. 940 versus 12.
Those two numbers come from the same economy, the same period of growth, the same companies, the same productivity gains. The math does not add up unless you understand that the distribution of those gains was a choice, not a natural outcome, but a decision made by people with the power to make it. Now, the standard response to all of this is that the market is fair, that wages reflect productivity, that if you want to earn more, you need to develop skills the market values, work harder, upskill, negotiate better. And there is something in that. Skills matter. Individual choices matter. Negotiation matters. But here is the problem with that framing. It puts the entire burden of a structural problem onto individual behavior. It says, the system is fine, you are just not optimizing hard enough. Consider this. The United States spends more per student on higher education than almost any country on earth. Millions of young people, following the advice to upskill and invest in themselves, took on student loan debt to get degrees that the labor market told them it valued. Between 2000 and 2020, average student debt more than doubled. Graduate earnings in many fields did not keep pace. The credential that was supposed to buy labor market leverage instead became a financial anchor, paid for with wages that were already falling behind. This is not a conspiracy. It is an incentive structure. And incentive structures left uncorrected compound over time. The genuinely uncomfortable truth is this. The meritocracy story, work hard, add value, get rewarded, describes how individuals can improve their relative position within a distribution. It does not explain what determines the distribution itself. And the distribution has been shifting steadily and measurably away from labor and toward capital for 50 years. Here is why this matters beyond your personal paycheck. Economies run on consumer spending. In the United States, roughly 70% of GDP is consumer expenditure. For that spending to continue, consumers need either rising incomes or rising debt. And for the last 3 decades, the answer has largely been rising debt. Household debt in America has grown faster than household income for most of the period since 1980. Credit cards, auto loans, student loans, home equity lines. People have maintained their standard of living not by earning more, but by borrowing more, often from the same financial institutions whose shareholders have benefited most from the wage-capital gap. This is not a stable system. It has breaking points. The 2008 financial crisis was, at its root, a consequence of this dynamic. Households that had borrowed against an asset base that could not support the debt load they had accumulated. And beyond economics, there is a political dimension that is already playing out in real time. When large numbers of people feel that the economic system is not delivering for them, that they work hard, follow the rules, and still fall behind, they stop trusting institutions. They stop trusting governments. They look for explanations, and often for someone to blame. The politics of resentment, the rise of populism, the breakdown of institutional trust across developed economies, these are not simply cultural phenomena. They have an economic substrate, and that substrate is, in significant part, 50 years of wages falling behind. So let us come back to where we started. You got a raise, and it did not feel like enough. And now you know that feeling is not a personal failure. It is data.
It is you experiencing in your own bank account the downstream effect of 50 years of structural choices about who gets to capture the value that workers create. Union density fell, labor market concentration rose, non-competes spread, inflation eroded purchasing power, student debt rose faster than graduate wages, and at every step, the people setting the rules had a clearer understanding of the math than the people living inside it. None of this means individual effort is pointless. It is not. But individual effort is not the same thing as a fair system, and understanding the difference, understanding that your salary is not simply a reflection of your value, but an outcome of a negotiation you're barely aware you're having, is at minimum the beginning of seeing the situation clearly. The question worth sitting with is this:
Every dollar that should have gone into wages and did not went somewhere. It went into profit margins, into executive compensation, into shareholder returns, into the financial instruments that sit on top of the real economy and collect a toll every time money moves. That money did not disappear. It was redirected. And the system that redirected it is still running, right now, on your next paycheck.